You can connect to many kinds of databases in the Power BI cloud. The database you want to access will likely depend on the databases your own organization utilizes to store and query data. This is not a course on databases or Azure, but identifying them as database connection types in Power BI Dataflows means that you can explore how to tap into their potential. To set up the database connection, you will typically need credentials like the server name, the database name, and any related login credentials to access them. It's also helpful to know what tables you want to query or bring in the data from, especially if you're working with a large database. SQL Server is an example of a well-known relational database. It consists of tables within a database that we can query to create sets of useful data. An organization hosts a server like SQL Server on premises instead of in the cloud. Conversely, Microsoft's Azure allows you to connect to data sources like blobs, tables, SQL databases, and even to data analyzed through machine learning technologies. The databases work very much like the on-premises servers much of the time, except the users access them through the cloud instead of the on-premises server. You can also connect to databases using predefined queries for related, multidimensional tables instead of querying using SQL. Many of you may work at organizations that heavily rely on database connections like this for scalability as well as security across a very large user base. If you want to connect to these databases, you will not find this option available as a Power BI Dataflow connection. Instead, you connect to these databases at datasets, which you first set up in Power BI Desktop. Power BI datasets are live connection types that you can actually leverage a few options for these database connections. There are currently two ways to set up a SQL Server Analysis Services connection in Power BI Desktop. You can set up a live connection to the model, which makes Power BI a front-end process only by removing the ETL capabilities. You can also set it up using a DAX query on the database connection through the import connection type. This query returns results that we can continue to modify using the ETL capabilities. It's a bit like running a SQL query on a relational database. In the Power BI service, let's add a new entity to the existing data flow called testing tables we created for the manually entered data table. We click to enter into the data flow. We can now select Add Entities as the menu option at the top. We now see there are a plethora of database options. If we select on the database menu, you can see many different kinds of databases, including that fourth SQL Server. Notice that you did not see the option for SQL Server Analysis Services. You can see it in the Azure Options menu, but there are several database connection options as well. Let's select the SQL Server Database connection. You can see where you entered the server name and the database name in the connection settings. You'll also need to add your login credentials to access the database. When you select the gateway to use, you'll save the login credentials for this database to the gateway. It will save the server and database name as well as any pertinent login credentials, such as the username and password. You can also set up the gateway connection to the database before you even set up a new query within the data flow. Let's navigate to the Managed Gateways option in the Settings menu. We first cancel out of the query that we set up. Now go into Manage Gateways to set up the gateway connections before we set up the connection to the data source. We can see where we can add new connections. You can see that we can set up connections on this page by naming a new data source, and then selecting the data source type from the drop-down menu. If you select, say, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, you can see where you're going to enter the details for the data connection. We can discard the changes because we're not going to add the connection right now. Now let's navigate back into our workspace. If you want to connect to SQL Server Analysis Services, you'll need to set up this connection through the datasets functionality instead of the data flows. To access a new dataset, select Create, then choose the dataset option. We can then select Databases and we see that the SQL Server Analysis Services is one of the tiles on this page. Selecting this data source, we see that the connecting directly to the data source is now deprecated in Power BI instead. You'll first create the data connection as a live connection or an import connection in Power BI Desktop. You then publish it to the Power BI Cloud to make it shareable with others. Setting up web connections. In today's world, we have access to many online data sources, including both free, publicly available data and paid subscription services. Please note to exercise caution when connecting to online data sources as links can change and these changes remain out of our control. Let's say that we want to get Microsoft reported financial data for the past 5 years from the MarketWatch website. You see on the screen that this resource provides us data tables on a web page. If you right-click on the interface and select Inspect, this now shows us the code that drives the website that we actually see in the interface. When we set up a web connection to this URL in Power BI, it connects the code behind the web page, not the actual interface. In the Power BI Cloud, let's add a new entity to our testing tables Dataflow. We select Add New Entity and we want to choose Web as our source. We can now paste the URL link in the space denoted for the connection settings. And now notice that you need to set up a gateway connection for this website. If we select Anonymous and hit Next, let's see what the result is. We get a message that says invalid credentials at the top and it doesn't give us an option to not select the gateway. Power BI is throwing us an error message for this connection. Even if we change the HTTPS to an HTTP, the connections still cannot get set up, and this is an example of concern about the stability of these online sources. Web pages can change and I've connected to the same source in Power BI Desktop and I've had it work. So we want to make sure that we account for the stability of these web data sources, which is where we could perhaps use an API connection instead of connecting directly to a web page. Let's cancel out of this new query, and if we navigate to our Manage Gateways section, notice that we now see the MarketWatch data source connection even though the connection didn't necessarily work. To remove this data connection, select the menu option and choose Remove. So now we have our gateway cluster updated to include the actual data that we're using. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. You can find full tutorial of Power BI in the following videos. Keep watching.